if you can't be open and transparent with money, then you shouldn't be trusted with it. Is that a fair statement to make? For example, if your local authority, your council, called you up and said, you have to pay more council tax because we've just found a huge debt that we didn't realise we had, but they refused to tell you what that debt was, that would concern you, would it not? That would lead you potentially to distrust your local authority for not being open and transparent with you about their debts. Well, that is exactly what governments have done just recently. Let me take you back to September 2022. That was when Liz Truss got into government as Prime Minister for a very short time. This was the story from the BBC on the 20th of September 2022, when the Treasury refused to publish the economic forecast for the UK. Of course, Rachel Reeves, the current Chancellor, posted a tweet about that and said, if you cannot be open and transparent about the economy, you cannot be trusted to run it. It's as simple as that, she said. And you might well agree with that statement. If you cannot be open and transparent about the economy, you cannot be trusted to run it. However, the hypocrisy of the current government prevails. Now, I show you those previous stories and tweets because some people have accused me of being partisan, one side or the other, and that's not the case. I'm telling you both sides of this equation, and it seems to me that parties of more than one political persuasion have lacked the transparency that you might expect. However, as I said, the hypocrisy continues. That is with this recent story from the Financial Times, where the UK Treasury refuses to disclose key details of this so-called £22 billion black hole that you've heard so much about. Or have you? Have you really heard so much about it? Or have you just heard the term being floated around? Because the Financial Times was quite curious as to what this £22 billion black hole was really made up of. Because many people say that a lot of this 22 billion was made up of chunks of unaccounted spending that was already earmarked or reserved for future spending and that this current government was already aware of. For example, the largest chunk of unaccounted spending was £8.6 billion, which was earmarked for normal reserve claims. This included things such as election funding, reclassification of flood defences programme, resettlement arrangements from Afghanistan, but has failed to quantify them. Now, the reason to be concerned with this £22 billion black hole, of course, is that Sir Keir Starmer, in his questions in the House of Commons, emphasised that this £22 billion black hole was justification for the changes that they're about to make, which are going to be quote-unquote painful. Now, this obviously raising concern led to the Financial Times filing a Freedom of Information request for an exact breakdown of these figures. But, surprise, surprise, that request was declined. So, despite the previous tweet that I mentioned by Rachel Reeves, the current Chancellor, saying if you cannot be open and transparent about the economy, you cannot be trusted to run it, the current Treasury, have declined a request for the Freedom of Information to disclose an exact breakdown of whatever this £22 billion black hole is. This is the sort of equivalent of saying there's a spaceship in my garden, you just have to trust me because it's invisible. And I borrow the quote from Derren Brown, because how on earth is anyone to trust what you say about something unless you can specify it and break this down? Now, once again, I'm not being partisan. I've criticised both governments here because neither government, past nor present, have disclosed key information that the public are really entitled to. The comments back and forth on X, or Twitter if you really insist, have said that this is a public finance issue. It is the public purse, public money, and therefore the public are entitled to know exactly what this so-called hole is made up of. And that's not the only hypocrisy to shine a light on in this video, but more about that in just a moment. Now, speaking of transparency, money and security, you might think that if you use a financial organisation to transfer money that your information will remain secure. Well, think again, because this little gem just hit the headlines with MoneyGram confirming a hack that has leaked lots of information, including social security numbers or national insurance numbers, driving licenses, and other customers' information, all being released from a cybersecurity attack. Now, this has affected more than 150 million customers across over 200 countries and territories, and they've confirmed that this was a data breach on their website, explaining that the information is different for each user, and the information stolen includes names, home addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, birthdays, social security numbers, bank account numbers, and the list of information goes on. Why am I telling you all this? Well, in light of all the transparency issues with government, when ostensibly you can't even trust the government, and with news stories like this, you can't even trust these financial companies, your information is going to be out there somewhere for someone to buy and sell, and might ultimately end up on the dark web. And that is why I partner with a company on this channel called Incog. Now, what Incog does is contact hundreds of data brokers and marketers and insist and require that they remove all of your information from their databases, because these companies will doubtless scoop up all of this information from these data leaks, and they'll be selling it on to other people. Now, the more data brokers and marketers that have got your information, the more likely it is that you're going to end up a victim of identity theft. Your information is going to end up on the dark web somewhere, and nefarious actors are going to use it and try to con or defraud you. You can hopefully stop that from happening by signing up with Incog, which is a very straightforward sign-up process. It is a done-for-you service. They do all of the work, which will save you, I think they told me, over 80 hours worth of work they've saved me so far by contacting all these companies and requiring under UK law and US law that they remove my information from their servers. Of course, as a partner to my channel, you'll get a 60% discount off an annual plan. Use the code BlackBelt at the link in the description below. And these leaks are only just going to continue and get worse. And so this is an ongoing process. So Incog will continue to work and continue to remove your information from databases. I've had lots of lovely messages from you guys that have signed up and told me that you're amazed at how many companies have removed their data, your data, from their servers. So I'm pleased that it's working for you. Do check it out at the link in the description below. They are a trusted partner of mine. I would not recommend someone to you that I would not use myself. I've used Incog for quite some time now, and it gives me peace of mind that I do so. So check out Incog to protect your personal data moving forward. Use the code BlackBelt for a 60% discount off an annual plan. And in this present day of uncertainty, this will give you a little bit more peace of mind. Now, aside from anything else, the current government is using this so-called £22 billion black hole, of which they refuse to disclose details, to justify the cuts to the winter fuel allowance and the proposed tax raid and attack upon private schools via the addition of VAT. More about that in a moment, because there's a couple of things you probably haven't thought of. But first, the winter fuel allowance. Not only have they spent several years campaigning as part of their campaign to say they'll protect the winter fuel allowance and they will vehemently defend the removal of it, but you'll also recall Sir Keir Starmer rather sarcastically berating Rishi Sunak from the opposite side of the House of Commons in the mere suggestion that this was on the table for consideration to remove this winter fuel allowance in the first place, and they're going ahead with it anyway.
Last year, the Prime Minister was apparently drawing up plans to remove the winter fuel allowance from pensioners. His Paymaster General went a step further. He said these are the sorts of things that we need to look at. So will he now rule out taking pensioners' winter fuel payments off them to help fund his £46 billion black hole?
But now what about the proposed tax raid on private schools and the attack on children's education? Many of you might think that the tax is a justified thing, but I'd like you to hear me out, because there's a few things here that just don't quite add up. Let's go through a couple of tweets from the current Secretary of State for Education. Remember Bridget Phillipson, the one that had the £14,000 birthday party paid for by Lord Ali? Well, let's take a look at a couple of tweets here. First of all, she said on the 8th of October, a couple of days ago, today, then, the Conservatives tried to use parliamentary time to protect private schools' tax breaks. Now, first of all, it's not a tax break. A tax break is when you pay tax and you have tax reduced because of one thing or another. That is not the case here. And it's not the case because it's not a tax break, it's an exemption. It's a VAT exemption. Now, many of you might then say, well, they shouldn't have the exemption. Private schools shouldn't have this VAT exemption on their fees. But how about if I tell you this, because many people don't know this, gambling is also exempt from VAT, as is credit cards, mortgages, other kind of loans, other kinds of children's clothing, because baby wear and children's clothes and footwear are 0 rated. And so that's the first thing to consider. It's not a tax break, it's an exemption. And I must admit, I did reply to this to clarify the situation and said VAT exemption is not a tax break. The Secretary of State for Education doesn't know the difference. Adding tax to children's education is abhorrent, in my personal view. And no, I didn't go to a private school. I went to a comprehensive school, which I think is now an academy. But I would support parents that do work hard to send their children to private school, many of whom sacrifice lots of things, including holidays, and they drive old cars and all sorts of stuff that you might expect. They're not all rich, posh snobs that you might expect that just send their children to private school. Many of them really will struggle with this VAT addition. But not only that, every child that goes to a private school saves on average $6,000 to $8,000 a year, all of which will be an additional burden on those state schools if they are forced to leave the private school and move there. And this is very much the case in a lot of cases that I've heard of. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because I'm well informed that this could be upwards of £20,000 or £30,000 a year if special education needs children have to move from private schools back to state schools. And in one ridiculous example that I heard of, where there wasn't place at the state school, they then had to pay for the place at the private school to send the child back where they came from. But as I mentioned in my post here, my response, examples of VAT exemptions include any kind of insurance and finance and credit services products. Some person in the comment thread said they didn't know what credit services were. Now, that alarmed me because on the one hand, they're arguing about this topic, which is reasonably complex when you do break it down, and they didn't understand what credit services are, even though they remain VAT exempt. Now, with all respect to that person, they don't have a place in this argument if they don't understand where these VAT exemptions apply. But they do apply to education, training services, charitable fundraising events, subscription and membership organizations, selling, leasing and commercial property, and that list goes on. And that's not the only hypocrisy that I've noticed spewing out of this current government. Now, as I say, I am not partisan. I am calling it as I see it, which is what I promised you on this channel. I am saying what I see, and I give you my views on what I see. But I will certainly back up mine with information here and referring to old stories, old tweets, and previous inconsistent statements, which is what I do as a barrister. Now, looking at this post here from the 5th of October, Bridget Phillipson said, "Our state schools need teachers more than private schools need embossed stationery." As though the embossed stationery is going to pay for teachers? Well, the government could choose to pay for those teachers in state schools regardless of the VAT exemption from private schools. They could simply find the money elsewhere. For example, the government currently spends a huge amount of money overseas in aid and immigration and everything else, but let's not get into that just yet. That's perhaps the subject for another video. However, comparing embossed stationery in a private school, which is not their focus, by the way, I can assure you of that, with teachers in state schools is just a ridiculous comparison to make, and quite an embarrassing one in my view for the Secretary of State for Education. Not to mention, by the way, that all of the stationery for the Education Secretary will be embossed stationery because that's what they have in Parliament. So she's using it and yet criticising it at the same time. Levels of hypocrisy off the charts. But then she says our children need mental health support more than private schools need new pools. Well, there are lots of private schools that I'm familiar with that don't have a swimming pool. In fact, most state schools that I'm aware of have better facilities than the private schools that I'm aware of. But then the final one is where the real hypocrisy jumps out here. She says our students need careers advice more than private schools need AstroTurf pitches. However, the news once again was quick to jump out to pull out the hypocrisy. This credit to the Telegraph. I won't show you the photograph because I respect the copyright of Luke Trevelson. You can go and see the photograph by himself on the Telegraph website. But believe it or not, according to the Telegraph, just hours before Bridget Phillipson posted this comment about AstroTurf pitches and private schools, she herself was photographed playing hockey on the AstroTurf of a private school. And then to contradict it all, in my view, of course, she posted this about an hour ago. The measures we've brought forward show we are a child-centred Labour government, putting education back at the heart of national life. Now, she might well believe that these measures are putting children's education back at the heart of national life, but so long as you're not a child in the middle of your education in a private school whose parents just won't be able to afford it with the VAT, where they'll be uprooted and sent elsewhere in the middle of GCSEs, in the middle of their A-levels, or just just in the middle of their education in general. But there are simply so many other places they could raise this money. For example, gambling, or even children's clothing over a certain value of item for certain things. The gambling industry, by way of example, is a £16 billion industry, so if they added VAT to that, that would probably be double the amount of money they are said to raise from this raid on private schools, even though a lot of people have disputed those figures that they've said they're going to raise from adding VAT to private schools. I just think the whole thing is abhorrent. It is raiding children's education and dressing it up as being for the greater good. There are so many other ways of doing it. But either way, I hope that's given you something to think about, and even if you don't agree with what I've said, I hope it's given you some more information than you had when you first started watching the video. So I hope you found that useful. Please do remember to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.